Plot. The elements of plot are probably one of the first elements of literature that you come to understand even as a very young reader. Before you can read, you know what happens next in a story. Plot, on a very concrete level, is just the sequence and series of events in a text. But we're going to look at this at a much deeper level too. I like to think of plot as a domino rally. Certainly you've set up dominoes in a certain design and then see what sort of things happen after you hit one over and then others follow. So you can watch that video of the domino tricks while I explain these different stages of plot. So there are typically 5 stages of plot. The first is called the introduction, and this is when the characters and setting of a story are introduced. The rising action is usually the longest portion of the plot, and this is where all of the conflicts are introduced. There can be one overarching conflict and then multiple smaller ones. There might be some that are more significant than others. However, they are all introduced at some point during the rising action. The climax is a difficult one and probably one of the most significant parts of the plot. It's difficult because it's usually defined as just one single event, and sometimes readers cannot agree on what that one single event is that you would define as the climax. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. After the climax is the falling action, and some people refer to this as the denouement. And this is when all of those sort of loose ends start to get tied up. There's usually very few things that happen during the falling action, but it leads into the resolution or conclusion where all of those major conflicts have now been resolved and no further conflicts are introduced. So about the climax. You've certainly learned about plot in the past, so how would you define the climax? Some people refer to it as the most exciting part of the story. Another way some people define climax is the most important part of a story. Some even say it's the point where there's the most action or emotion. Unfortunately, none of these is exactly true. While it is correct that the climax could be the most exciting part, or the most important, or where there's the most action or emotion, those definitions do not correctly define the climax. If you are considering that the climax is a single event, then you would usually want to define it as the turning point of a story. In other words, this is the single event after which no additional conflicts or problems were introduced. It's possible that this is the single event that led to the resolution of most, all, or at least the major overarching conflict of the story. And let me just explain for a second why it cannot be the most exciting, most important part of a story or the point with the most action or emotion. All of those definitions are subjective, which means that from one reader or listener or viewer to another, the answer may differ. What one person thinks is the most exciting part of a story is not necessarily what someone else thinks. So if we are going to identify a single event, and we want everyone to be able to identify the same single event, then the definition cannot be subjective. In addition to the stages of plot, authors may employ other plot devices. You're probably familiar with most of these. The first is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is when the author will give you clues earlier in the story or in the book as to something that might happen later. Sometimes we don't even notice these the first time we read, and then if something happens, we recall that the author did give us that clue at some point. Another plot device used often is flashback. Flashback is when the narrator or a main character remembers something that happened in the past, and the narrative turns to an event that happened in the past. It almost interrupts the story and sort of takes over what's going on. The last that many of you are familiar with, and maybe some of you like, is the cliffhanger ending. A cliffhanger ending is when you really don't have a resolution. It might actually end at the climax or immediately after, and the audience is left wondering, how is it going to end? So lastly, how do we make these very concrete and often simple elements of plot a little more abstract and analyze them? First thing you want to do is identify the sequence and series of events. Some authors use a very clear chronological or sequence structure. Some use more of a cause and effect structure. Pay attention to where the author might have used a cliffhanger ending, maybe not at the end of the story, but at end of chapters. Where were flashbacks or foreshadowing used? Did the author change the point of view at any point? Another thing to look for are patterns in the way events are sequenced and how they are connected or lead into one another. Some authors like to introduce a small conflict. They'll have a little turning point for that conflict. Alright, it will seem as though things are resolved, but then a larger conflict will then be introduced. Next, try to determine why the author chose this particular sequence. Why is the author choosing to give you this information in this order? There's something about how the author wants you to know things and understand the order in which things are happening. For example, if something is revealed in a flashback that you might not have known otherwise, then you need to ask the question, why is the author telling me this? Why is he or she giving me this piece of information? Next, pay close attention to these additional plot devices. They're definitely there for a reason. I gave an example for the flashback, foreshadowing. If you see things that stand out and seem to be a hint, it's something to highlight, make an annotation, try to guess and think about what it could be cluing you into. And lastly, you can always bring plot to a deeper level by connecting these different stages of the plot or different events that have happened throughout the plot to other elements of literature. Easy ones to connect it to are conflict, because most of those events that fall in the rising action section are conflicts or somehow directly related to a conflict or developing a conflict. The climax can sometimes help you to determine the theme as well. As you get to that event, whatever is happening, that is the turning point, all right, leading to a resolution of a major conflict, you can ask the question, what is the author trying to tell me about this particular conflict? And that may lead you to theme. The climax also could relate to characterization. If the turning point was related to a conflict that a character had with another character, or even a character versus self conflict, then that turning point might indicate some dynamic characterization with your character. As we move on in this unit, you should be prepared to identify specific events in the different parts of plot or connect events to their correct stage of the plot. You should definitely be able to identify a climax and be able to explain why the event you chose is in fact the climax. We will also talk about some of these questions about why the author chose to sequence events in the way that they did and how that may have affected other elements of the book.